Hello, everyone. This is Roger Harrison, and welcome to another edition of the Sports Deep Dive Podcast. If you've listened to the other episodes of the Sports Deep Dive Podcast, we thank you. Please share them with a friend, and be sure to like and subscribe. Now, today we're going to take a look at lawsuits, the ACC and Clemson. Now, I'm not going to talk about the current lawsuit with Clemson and the ACC. If you want more information about that, you've got other resources for that. No, I'm going to look at a lawsuit, the ACC versus the ACC was involved and Clemson was involved, but this was way back in the early, in the 20th century. So let's take a look. And in order to do that, we're going to take a deep dive into Clemson football. So let's get started. So on October 31st, 1896, that is Halloween 1896, Clemson played its first football game. Defeated Furman University 14-6 in Greenville, South Carolina. It was the first time that many of the Clemson players had seen a full-size football gridiron. There wasn't a stadium yet in Clemson. They played on a field in front of one of their buildings for practice. And then when they played Furman, that was the first time. Charlie Gentry is credited with scoring the Tigers' first touchdown. So again, first football game, October 31st, 1896. They defeated Furman 14-6 in Greenville. So the Tigers would go on from there, forming a making a football team more formal, hiring coaches, getting players, and that type of thing. Now, in February 21st, 1921, so we're jumping 25 years from their first football game, in Atlanta, Georgia, 14 member institutions split from the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association and formed the Southern Conference. Southern Conference is still around today. It is considered an FCS conference. Southern Conference charter members were Alabama, Auburn, Clemson, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Kentucky, Maryland, Mississippi State, North Carolina State, Tennessee, Virginia, Virginia Tech, and Washington and Lee. Now, in 1922, 6 more universities, Florida, LSU, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tulane, and Vanderbilt joined the conference. The first year of competition for the conference was 1922, effective January 1. Later additions would include Sewanee in 1924 and VMI, Virginia Military Institute, in 1924, and Duke in 1929. So just based on that list, it was a rather large conference. Now, that's one of the reasons why the SEC was formed in the 30s, because this conference was way too big. All right, so now the SoCon, as it's known, the Southern Conference, had a rule that had prohibited anyone but the conference champion from participating in a football bowl game. Because at the time, conferences did not do revenue sharing. So in 1950, a 9-0-1 Clemson team went to the Orange Bowl. And the conference champion that year was Washington and Lee, who did not go bowling. They decided, no, we're not going to do that. It's too much. We're not going down there. So Clemson went. SoCon told Clemson, don't do that again. And then decided to ban postseason play in all sports. So that means that no postseason for anybody in the conference. So Clemson and Maryland then accepted bowl bids in 1951. Clemson the Gator and Maryland the Sugar, when VMI and Maryland tied for the conference championship. So VMI was like, no, we're not going to either. And the ACC suspended both schools for 1952 and prohibited any Southern Conference school from playing them in football. So let me say that again. The ACC suspended both schools for 1952 and prohibited any Southern Conference school from playing them in football. So they had to, they played each other, Clemson and Maryland, but they had to scrap together their own schedule because not even their own conference prohibited them from playing their conference mates. So now, one of these schools in the Southern Conference, as I read to you before, is South Carolina. Now, Clemson and South Carolina, as you know, are a big, big rivalry. The Palmetto State rivalry. So, in 1952, there was the Clemson-South Carolina rivalry was in question. So upon request of both schools' presidents, Clemson and South Carolina, the South Carolina General Assembly passed a resolution on February 27th, 1952, ordering the game to be played. The Gamecocks won the contest 6-0. So South Carolina won the game 6-0, low scoring. Now the Southern Conference, the SoCon, reacted to the game by attempting to suspend Clemson, leading 7-member schools, including Clemson and South Carolina, to leave the league and form the Atlantic Coast Conference in May 1953. Now the ACC was established on June 14th, 1953, when 7 members of the Southern Conference left to form their own conference. These 7 schools became charter members of the ACC, include Clemson, Duke, Maryland, North Carolina, North Carolina State, South Carolina, and Wake Forest. Virginia would join a year later. Clemson, Duke, Maryland, North Carolina State, South Carolina, Wake Forest were the 7 original members of the ACC, and then then Virginia would join the following year to make it an even 8. All right, so let's go back and look at South Carolina. So South Carolina, along with Clemson, is now a member of the ACC. So upon taking the South Carolina job prior to the 1966 season, a head football coach and athletic director, Paul Densell, was alarmed by the ACC's dismal record of futility against non-conference opponents in football. The ACC ranked last among all conferences in terms of non-conference victories. Against the SEC in particular, the ACC had compiled an embarrassing record of 19 wins versus 105 defeats between 1953 and 1966. I want to say that again. Against the SEC, the ACC had compiled an embarrassing record of 19 wins versus 105 defeats between 53 and 66. I believe they have closed that gap, but that's still very bad. Now, this was particularly concerned to Densell, given that South Carolina's recruiting footprint overlapped with SEC schools to a greater extent than other ACC programs, with the exception of Clemson. So that gives you a good look at the lay of the land right there. Also, now before that, the ACC cited in 1964 that football and basketball prospects had to score at least an 800 on the SAT to qualify for athletic scholarship. Now that's football and basketball prospects had to score at least an 800 on the SAT to qualify for an athletic scholarship. So in 1966, it extended this policy to athletes who participated with or without financial aid in any intercollegiate sport. So first it was just for football and basketball prospects, and then in 1966 it was extended in any sport. Now Clemson's president, Robert Edwards, noted that 93.4% of black high school seniors in the state of South Carolina who took the SAT that year scored below the 800 mark that the ACC had set. Now, Densel from South Carolina led a faction of ACC administrators wishing to scrap the 800 rule in favor of the NCAA's less restrictive 1.6 GPA model. The ACC had the 800 rule. They wanted to scrap that and take on the NCAA's less restrictive 1.6 GPA. Denzel received highly vocal support from Clemson's head football coach, Frank Howard. You may recognize that name, Howard's Rock at Memorial Stadium in Clemson. But anyway, so he got vocal support from Clemson's head football coach, Frank Howard, as well as officials at North Carolina State and Maryland, while North Carolina, Duke, Wake Forest, and Virginia wanted to uphold the ACC standard. So that gives you an idea. What's funny is that North Carolina wanted to uphold the standard back then, and then when it came to vote for the new members of the ACC, the SMU and Cal and Stanford, North Carolina, again, didn't want them in there. But anyway, that's just a little thing. So the ACC was divided, and it's because, its members, South Carolina, Clemson, North Carolina State, and Maryland wanted to abolish the 800 rule. North Carolina, Duke, Wake Forest, and Virginia didn't. So South Carolina's officials, at Denzel's prompting, took matters in their own hands. So they gave Denzel the green light, or they gave all the coaches the green light to recruit on the basis of the NCAA's 1.6 GPA standard. So they're going against the conference, those crazy guys at South Carolina. So on March 29th, 1971, South Carolina's Board of Trustees announced that the university would withdraw from the ACC effective August 15th of that year. And then that later was advanced to June 30th. So they originally said August 15th, and they said, you know what, we're going to do it June 30th. All right, so this is where the lawsuit in Clemson University comes in. The 800 rule controversy was resolved a short time later when two student athletes at Clemson University filed suit in federal court against Clemson and the ACC. Now this time, Clemson is in the lawsuit with the ACC as opposed to today when Clemson is against the ACC. So the student attorneys argued that the 800 rule deprived them of their constitutional rights to equal protection under the 14th Amendment, since the rule only applied to athletes. And that is a good argument, ladies and gentlemen, in my opinion. On August 7th, 1972, the U.S. District Court Judge Robert Hemphill agreed that the ACC standard was, quote, arbitrary and capricious and not based on valid reasoning, end quote. 11 days later, just over 13 months after South Carolina's ACC exit, the ACC dropped the embattled 800 rule. So by that time, South Carolina was an independent, and coming back to the ACC was out of the question. I mean, because they had bridges were burned, probably by both sides. In fact, there's a and I couldn't find any evidence on that. But there was even rumors that South Carolina asked Clemson to come with them and say, "Come on, let's leave this crappy conference." Clemson said no, obviously, because they are still members of the ACC, and South Carolina is not. So, unbeknownst at that time, South Carolina began what would prove to be a 20-year journey in independent status. So that is today's deep dive. So we took a look at another lawsuit that Clemson was involved in, this time brought on by two of its student athletes between Clemson and the ACC because of the rule. Now, the Atlantic Coast Conference prides itself on having great academic standards. I believe the Big Ten does as well. But this certainly was one that was an arbitrary, according to the judge that ruled in favor of the two student athletes. So there you go. That was today's sports deep dive. A little shorter one today. Taking a look, like I said, it's Clemson is involved in a lawsuit against the ACC, and that's over their grant of rights agreement. And like I say, if you want more information about that, there are other places to look for that. Here at the Sports Deep Dive, we try to look at other aspects that maybe other outlets aren't covering in the world of sports, and we handle both pro and college. Please take a look at some of our previous podcasts, and be sure to sign up for notifications of when the next Sports Deep Dive podcast is available. I am Rogers Harrison, and I hope you enjoyed today's Sports Deep Dive. Have a good day.